In Galatians 4 verse 10, Paul gives a passage that many people say today proves that the Old Testament feast days and Sabbath are no longer necessary. Is this the case? Well, let's find out. Hey, this is Pastor Randy. I'd like to welcome you to Drive-By Teaching. Today I want to focus on something Paul said in Galatians 4 verse 10. Here's what he says in Galatians 4 verse 10. He says, you observe days and months and times and years. Now, verse 11, he goes on and says this. He says, I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. Now, many people assume that Paul here is referring to the Old Testament days of worship, like the Sabbath and feast days. So Paul's saying that these people were going back to the Jewish faith. They were worshiping the Sabbath. They were worshiping the feast days. And he said, because of this, I'm afraid of you. In other words, they were going backwards instead of going forwards. Is this the message of Scripture? Well, it's so important that we understand context. Context is key. And if we go back to verse 8, we're going to understand what Paul's saying here. He says, howbeit then, when you knew not Yahweh, you did service unto them which by nature are no mighty ones. So notice that this is speaking about a time before they came to the faith. In verse 9 it says, but now, after that you have known Elohim, or rather are known of Elohim. You see, Yahweh calls us, we don't call Yahweh, we see that here. How turn you again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? So what is Paul referring to here? Or he's referring to days, again, that were not part of biblical worship. They were not part of what we find in the Old Testament. They were part of their old worship prior to coming to the faith. So what was this faith? As believers, understanding the history of the Bible is so important. So who were the ancient Gauls, or the people of Galatia? These people came down from Northern Europe. We know that historically. So what worship did they participate in prior to coming to the faith? Or the worship they were a part of was the worship of the ancient Celts. And we know that the ancient Celts, of course, this is, one example is Halloween, or Samhain was the original day where they would actually burn people alive. So the religion of the ancient Celts in many ways was very barbaric. And this is the worship that Paul's referring to here, the worship of the faith prior to coming to know Yahweh, prior to coming to know the faith and the Messiah, Yahshua. So this is not referring to Old Testament days of worship. We see that from the context. Again, verse 8 is key. This is not referring to the Sabbath or the feast days we find in the Old Testament, but instead to old Celtic days of worship that they worshipped prior to their conversion. I want to talk about one more thing, and that is Paul is hard to understand. How do we know this? Or Peter, of all people, Peter understood this. Read you something Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 15. This is very important, by the way, to understand. It says, an account that the long-suffering of our Master is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul, also according to the wisdom given unto him, hath written unto you. So we find here that Peter here is referring to the Apostle Paul. Now listen to what he says next. He says, as also in all his epistles. So I want to stop here for just a moment. The word epistles here refers to Scripture. So Paul's writings were accounted as Scripture, and that's an important concept to understand. And that's why we believe here in both the Old and New Testaments. So epistles, speaking in them of these things in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other Scriptures, unto their own destruction. So we find here that Peter is acknowledging something very important for us to understand, and that is that the Apostle Paul was hard to comprehend, hard to understand. The way he spoke, the way he communicated, sometimes was confusing. And we see that within mainstream nominal worship today. Many ministers, they misinterpret, misunderstand Paul's writings because they're unlearned. They're unable to interpret rightly the Word, as we find in so many cases. And that's why it's so important to understand context again as we go back to Galatians chapter 4, that we understand what Paul is referring to in verse 10, that he's not referring to days that we find in the Old Testament, the Sabbath and feast days. No, he's referring to days that they were observing prior to their conversion to the faith. And what were those days? Or those days were, again, ancient Celtic worship that were detestable, that were just horrible days of worship. And Paul's saying, look, you're going backwards. You're not observing the Sabbath. You're not observing the feast days. You're not honoring your Father in heaven. You're not honoring the Messiah. You should, because you're going back to these old, detestable feast days of the Celtic religion, not of Scripture. Where I pray that this has been a blessing to you. And I would encourage you to watch all these drive-by teachings and to really study Scripture. Scripture says to prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. So that's an obligation we have as believers. I pray that you would do that. I thank you for joining me today, and until next time, may Yahweh bless you. Bye-bye.
This has been Drive-By Teaching with Pastor Randy. Join the conversation and leave us a like and comment below. Subscribe now for all our latest releases. For one of the most extensive religious websites ever, yrm.org. For all the ways to connect with us, see the description below. From all of us here at Drive-By Teaching, don't get stuck in the slow lane of tradition. Put the brakes on ignorance and put your understanding into overdrive.